Hello and welcome to A Woman's Heart. I'm Lisa Granger. Have you or someone you know experienced trauma? My guest today is Lisa Saruga, and she is here to say that healing is possible. She knows firsthand about the effects of trauma as a survivor and a therapist. She shares some insight about the effects of trauma and some practical tips on how to heal and grow. I believe this will be a very helpful conversation for many. So can you please share with someone? Welcome to A Woman's Heart. This is a special treat because I have a dear friend on today. We have Lisa Saruga on the show again. And thanks so much for joining us today, Lisa.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here.
Yes. Now, we have spoken before, so if anyone wants to listen to that previous conversation, they can. It includes a lot of your story, which we'll go into some today, but I think we're going to deal more with afterwards and the things that you have coming up now dealing with that. But real quick, since some people may not have heard our previous conversation and they don't know what an incredible woman you are, I would love for you to share a little bit about yourself and something fun that you don't normally put in your bio.
Oh, I love those trick questions.
Yes. You should know me well enough.
Yeah. Previously, when I was on, we talked about my own personal story. I am a trauma survivor, but I'm also a trauma therapist. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I do EMDR therapy with my clients who have suffered trauma, in addition to other kinds of therapy.
Yes.
And now I speak nationwide, and my first book is coming out very soon.
Yay! Congratulations! And you are up north where it is very, very cold today on our interview.
It is very cold. 15. The wind chill is 15 below.
Yeah, and that is why I don't live in Michigan. Oh, my goodness. Well, as we mentioned, you are a trauma survivor and you have a book coming out because one of the things that I admire about you, and I think you help a lot of women to do, is to not just survive and make it through, but actually thrive and help others. And I greatly admire that about you. And I would love for us to dive into some of the ways that you have been able to make that happen. You mentioned you have a book that's coming out, so please tell us about that. And in that you talk about trauma recovery from the perspective of a pear tree. So how did that come about?
That's a fun little story.
Yes.
I really wanted to write a book on trauma recovery because, you know, the main thing I want people to understand is that even when this world doesn't offer us a happy ending, healing is possible.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to write a book that somebody who has experienced trauma or maybe is in the thick of trauma could read it, and it would be soft reading, a soft approach to trauma recovery.
Yeah.
And the reason I used my little pear tree in the book is because that kind of does soften it. I mean, I talk about the trauma that my pear tree suffered, and it's just a tree. It's not a human being.
Yes.
But I was able to draw some pretty deep concepts without maybe re-traumatizing people as they read. So my book does include some other stories too. It deals with all kinds of trauma. I think maybe the first distinction to make is what is trauma?
Yeah. So what would your definition of trauma? Because I know a lot of times some people, you have what they call big T trauma and little T trauma. And it's not that, you know, they can both be very difficult to deal with. So yes, but please tell us a little bit about what your definition would be of trauma, and you can go into the differences.
Yeah, so I do break trauma down. Most professionals do into big T and little T trauma. Big T trauma is that life-threatening trauma that really changes life forever, and that can be a violent accident that maybe takes away some of your abilities. It could be the loss of a child or loss of a loved one. It can also be, like in my case, a violent crime. It's something that's very startling. Not everybody experiences big T trauma. And little T trauma, that's not to minimize little T trauma, but little T trauma would be things like divorce. It's a trauma for sure, but you're going to get through it, right?
Yeah.
Little T trauma can also be chronic. So when we look at child abuse, very traumatic experience, not always life-threatening, But little t trauma, chronic little t trauma that happens over a period of time can injure the brain the same way one big T trauma would.
Yeah.
So, like I said, that's not to minimize. Both kinds of trauma are very difficult to walk through.
Yeah, they are. And I think sometimes with the little t trauma, we can more easily minimize it and try to go, oh, well, it's not really that big a deal, especially as you mentioned, chronic trauma as a child. Say nobody was beaten, but maybe the words that were said that minimize them and diminish them over and over and over again. Some people may just say, oh, well, that was just growing up. That was just not a big deal.
Right.
But yet it really does affect your psyche and your mindset and how you view life and go through it. And it can be very damaging.
Right. And actually, when I talk about post-traumatic stress, I don't say post-traumatic stress disorder, I say injury. And the reason I say that is because trauma actually changes our brain.
Okay.
And I can explain that a little bit
Yeah.
if you want me to. But the one distinction I do want to make, though, is that not every little thing that goes wrong is trauma at all.
Yes.
I'd said it's 15 degrees below zero today. It's very cold. And I could say, oh, I'm traumatized by the weather. That's not trauma, that's drama.
Yeah.
And in the
Yes.
case of my little pear tree, it's really a drama that we're talking about. But trauma, real trauma, changes our brain.
Okay.
When we do scans, there's a little almond-shaped piece of our brain right in the center called the amygdala.
Mm-hmm.
And the amygdala is an irrational part of the brain. It's not you can't consciously access what's in the amygdala. It just holds on to memories that are associated with strong emotion. So that's where trauma lives. Trauma is always a memory that's associated with strong emotion. And it kind of hides in there. Trauma lives in the amygdala. And it can live there forever if it's not processed.
Okay.
And we can see on brain scans that when somebody's experienced a big T trauma or a chronic little T trauma, the amygdala actually grows.
Oh, okay.
And, you wouldn't think of that memory would take up space like in a computer, but the amygdala actually grows. And then there's another part of the brain called the hippocampus that kind of lays right over the top of the amygdala. That's the rational part of the brain that says to the amygdala, well, first let me talk about triggering. When we hear being triggered,
Yes.
the actual meaning of that is that something has reminded the amygdala of that memory, and it just releases all that emotion out into your system. So the same hormones and chemicals that created the emotional response at the time of the trauma is recreated by the amygdala.
Okay.
So the hippocampus, that rational part, is the part that says to the amygdala, oh, that happened 30 years ago. You're safe right now. You're okay.
Okay.
And when we do the brain scans, we see the amygdala grows and the hippocampus shrinks. And so now the triggering is kind of unchecked.
Okay.
So something might remind us of a trauma and we feel like we're right back in the midst of it again. You have flashbacks and nightmares and emotions that seem uncontrollable. That all is a result of an injury to the brain. So post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not a disorder that we're born with. It's an injury that occurs to our brain later.
Okay. Yeah. Now, and when you're flooded, some of the things that I've read are it's flood, your brain hits that and it may see when we're talking about being triggered, and it can't be just the emotional, but your body reacts as if it's like a physical threat, even though it may only be an emotional, and you may end up going into that fight or flight or freeze or fawn. There's actually 4 reactions to that. And when it does that, what are some ways that you teach people? Because there's so many different ways that it could be triggered, smells, sights, sounds, experiences, conflict with the personality. People that have a particular kind of personality could be very triggering. How do you teach people to maybe be able to take a pause or calm down enough to let the hippocampus or the other parts of our brain step in and go, okay, no, I know this is what you're feeling, but you really are safe right now. How do we kind of get to that point where we can calm down and not necessarily recognize what's going on, but then be able to move forward? That's
a really complicated question. It's a good question. First of all, I wouldn't separate the emotional from the physical response because our emotions
yeah.
are determined by a physical response, right?
Yes.
When we go into fight or flight, our brain is producing a hormone called adrenaline. When we calm, our brain is releasing maybe serotonin. There's several hormones and chemicals that
Yeah.
our brain produces or withholds, and that's what determines our emotions. You know, when you get scared and you start shaking, that's a physical response to an emotion.
Yes.
Because of that adrenaline. So when we're triggered, even though we're not conscious of it, there is something physically happening.
Yes.
Because we know that trauma lives in the amygdala, the answer to your question is we have to do some kind of treatment to that part of the brain. And a lot of times we just, sit and talk with somebody, do talk therapy, or maybe we just sit and let people talk and listen. That is a wonderful treatment, right?
Yeah.
To me, it's the equivalent. I had shoulder surgery last year. Before the surgery, I had stuff that was torn. My shoulder was really kind of a mess. Really good therapy was physical therapy so that I could keep the movement and ice to keep the swelling down. Those are great treatments. And talk therapy is a great treatment. But the cure was surgery. They had to go in and fix that. And the equivalent of that in therapy, I think, is EMDR therapy.
Okay.
Eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And I won't go into the weeds of what that means or science of how it works, but I will tell you that it's not as much talking, but it definitely involves the amygdala and memories associated with emotion. And we have found that we can actually, with using EMDR, kind of replace those triggered emotions with softer emotions. So it's not that the memory goes away or that you're not triggered, but when you're triggered, it's not as strong.
Okay. And you can maybe somehow reframe some of the narratives that we've told ourselves about the story, because I suspect, and I've read different things of when the trauma happens, a lot of times the narratives that we tell ourselves surrounding the trauma can be almost or more damaging, because we may not have had any control over the situation, but we'll tell ourselves that we did, and why didn't we? And so sometimes that can kind of heap the shame and guilt on top of the trauma, which just exacerbates it. But I imagine with something like EMDR and and other good effective treatments, we can soften that story and the narrative around it to empower ourselves to move forward, as opposed to letting ourselves get stuck in it. Does that make any sense?
It does. I think reframing is very important in therapy. But interesting, there's almost a couple sides to reframing. One is to soften, but the other is, I find most people who have experienced trauma tend to minimize it. And I think it's just self-preservation. I'll have people come into therapy and tell me just horrific incidences in their life. And when I call it trauma, when I name it trauma, they'll say, oh, it wasn't that bad. Or it was not a big deal. I moved on. And it's self-soothing, right? It's self-preservation to not think of it as a big deal. But it doesn't change that the whole thing is stored in your amygdala still, unprocessed, right? So we can do that for a long time. We can tell ourselves it wasn't a big deal, but our brain is still holding on to that big deal.
Yeah.
So some of that reframing is, let's call it trauma. Let's name what it is.
Yeah.
And, reframe that as a big deal. This was big in your life. So there's two different sides to that. You also talked about shame and guilt that we heap on ourselves.
Yes.
A lot of that does come internally, but we also get that from others. When we think of sexual assault in particular, we think of all the shaming and blaming.
Yes.
But that happens with most traumas. So I always think about the book of Job. Job experienced many big T traumas right in a row.
Yes, he did.
Right? He was, that's almost not survivable for most human beings.
No.
And when that happened, his friends came to support him. And when his friends came, for the first few days, they did exactly the right thing. They just sat with him, cried with him. They didn't talk. They just were there, right? And that's what we need when we've experienced trauma. We just need that support, that knowing somebody's there, we're not alone. But I think during those few days, they had some time to think about, oh, why'd this happen to Job? And I hope it never happens to me. right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then we start looking for, so why did it happen to Job? Because I don't want it to happen to me.
Yeah.
And so then these friends started saying, Job, what sin did you commit that made this happen?
Yeah.
Right? Now, Job was a righteous man. It wasn't a result of his sin. God doesn't punish us in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But still today, we'll say to people, maybe if you had done this differently, or telling ourselves, that guy got into my room because I didn't lock my door, so it was my fault. And that's where the blame and shame comes from. But I think the reason behind the blame and shame oftentimes is because we don't want it to happen to ourselves. So we start creating a narrative that says, well, he did something wrong. That's why it happened. So it's not going to happen to me.
Yeah. I hadn't
Right?
thought about it that way. In other people kind of trying to find a reason why it would happen to somebody else versus themselves and doing that. I'd never thought about it that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, self-preservation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's too hard to think about. And so there must be a reason for it that I can avoid.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of the trauma, thriving and recovering from the, as you mentioned, the injury, there's so many different ways that our brain will try to protect us, but it's not necessarily the most helpful way.
Right.
I would say. So, is there anything in particular you can think of that in our own self-preservation, say a trauma has happened and our brain's trying to protect us, maybe it's telling different stories that we need to do something in the future to keep it from ever happening. What are some of the, I would say, unhealthy coping mechanisms where maybe it is just a matter of our brains trying to protect us,
Yeah.
but it's not healthy or
Right.
helpful?
There's so many things that our brain does to protect us that are not healthy, and part of that is just dissociation. And after a trauma, many people will tell you the story, no emotion. They can just tell you the story right away. And that is what they're doing is the brain is replaying it like, I watched this in a movie. It didn't really happen to me. And we don't connect to what happened to us.
Okay.
And that dissociation is helpful at first because it's just too much to take in that just happened to me. But over time, we need to connect ourselves to what happened in order to move through the healing process. So that's just one example. But there is a lot of guilt and shame oftentimes following a trauma. And maybe it's similar to what others are doing. It won't happen to me again if I can figure out why it happened to me now. And that can lead to guilt, feelings of guilt and shame.
Now, in the process of recovering and treating the injury, one of the things that you have mentioned is forgiveness plays a part in that. And forgiveness is one of those things that we know as Christians we are supposed to do. We are commanded. We are supposed to forgive someone. But there's a lot of, it's not always easy. It's certainly not easy at all. And there's also some misconceptions around what forgiveness really is. So I would love for you to tell us, what part does forgiveness play in recovering from trauma? And maybe and in that, tell us what it isn't.
That's such a good question. And, my book is not about forgiveness, and there are many books written about forgiveness that I could recommend. But I do acknowledge that forgiveness is a part of moving on. The thing about trauma is it's an injury. Sometimes it's an injury that's been inflicted by someone else. And that's the person, when you try to think of forgiving a person who's inflicted that kind of injury, it seems impossible.
Yes.
So the first thing I want to assure people of is forgiveness doesn't have to happen immediately.
Yeah.
It's not possible to forgive in that moment because you need to deal with your own healing first. I hope that makes sense. I'm not saying don't forgive. The other thing is, for us to forgive somebody, they don't have to be deserving of it. It is not about the person that inflicted the injury. And, in my own story, I was attacked by a man in a ski mask. I didn't know him. The only memory I had of him was just pure evil. And I when that happened, I put it in a box, put it away. It's not going to bother me. It's no big deal. 35 years later, somebody called and identified that man, and my cold case was reopened. The first thing I will say about that is my amygdala held on to every memory.
Yeah.
Right? Because when that happened, all of a sudden, it was like I was 18 again, and it had just happened. I could remember what I was wearing. I could remember the smells in the room. Everything was well preserved. I had not just put it away. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if somebody had asked me to forgive him in that moment, I couldn't physically have even thought about that because I was reliving the evilness that I experienced, right?
Yeah.
So the first step is I need to get myself regulated
Yeah.
and then get on a path to healing. Then the second thing I need to know is a lot of times we hear forgiveness and reconciliation kind of used interchangeably.
Yeah, no.
I was not going to reconcile with somebody I never had a relationship with. It wouldn't have been safe. There was no purpose to reconciling with that man.
Yeah.
Forgiving him, if somebody had said I had to forgive him in that moment, I would have said, he has no remorse. It was completely evil. I'm not going to tell him it was okay. That's not what forgiveness is. I'm not telling him it's okay. His behavior was not okay. Forgiveness is about the forgiver.
Yeah.
And forgiveness simply means I'm going to lay down the hurt that I feel. I'm going to lay down my fear. I'm going to give that back to God. And I'm not going to let it ruin my life. I'm not going to let that bring me down anymore. So forgiveness is a letting go of what's bringing you down.
Yeah.
It's not one and done. I think forgiveness is a process. I think probably for the rest of my life, I'll have to re-forgive and re-forgive in that circumstance.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to point out is that sometimes the person who creates the injury is somebody that you know, or maybe even somebody that you love.
Yeah.
And that's difficult because if that person, if it's not safe, if it's not a safe relationship, if it would be unhealthy to reconcile, reconciliation is not part of the requirement.
Yeah.
You know, forgiveness can be very difficult because maybe the person who has caused your injury is going to be at family Christmas. So then how do you handle that?
Yeah.
And I don't say you have to go back and pretend like it didn't happen. That's not safe.
Yeah.
So it may be that there needs to be distance. It might be maybe you would one day be able to be in a room with that person, but keeping an emotional distance, not speaking to them. That doesn't mean you haven't forgiven. That doesn't mean you haven't let go of the fear. But you need to keep those appropriate boundaries still too.
Yeah. Yeah. The word boundary is the one that came up for me. And like you said, it may not be safe emotionally or physically or mentally. It may just not
Right.
be safe that you can forgive, but that doesn't mean that everything goes back the way it was. Doesn't mean that it was okay. And a lot of times people can kind of get stuck in that. And one of the terms you mentioned in here is the concept of post-traumatic growth. And there's that thing, there's that song, whatever doesn't kill you makes you
Yeah.
stronger. Well, and then the T-shirt that says "Except bears, they'll kill you." But the idea of the growth afterward, how do we do the growth instead of shriveling because of the trauma?
Yeah. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, we hear that phrase all the time. And that's actually, I want to acknowledge that is the correct diagnosis if you're looking at the DSM.
Yes.
There are many of us who are trying to have that changed to PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury, for the reasons I've said. But we don't hear about post-traumatic growth. And that is actually a thing. Look it up. And there's actually a measurable scale to determine if there's post-traumatic growth. And it is possible, but it's not inevitable. When we say whatever makes us, whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger, that's not true.
Yeah.
About 60% of trauma survivors show signs of post-traumatic growth. That's good, but that means 40%
Don't.
are not really, they're not better. They're not stronger after. They're damaged and weakened and struggling.
Yeah.
I often say a lot of times we call people trauma survivors.
Yes.
And I don't use the word survivor very often. After an assault, after my assault, people would say, oh, you were sexually assaulted, so you're a survivor. Well, that was a lot of pressure to carry because then I felt like I was supposed to behave like a survivor when inside My body was saying, I don't feel like I'm surviving at all. I'm breathing, if that's what you mean by surviving,
Yeah.
right?
You're still alive, but not
Yeah.
thriving at
Well,
all.
and if that's what survival is, don't we want more,
Yeah.
right? Just breathing is not strength.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think, we have to keep in mind that we don't get over trauma, we get through it.
Okay.
And that takes time, it takes effort. There are things that you can do to help yourself heal so that you can experience post-traumatic growth. And that's the ideal thing. We want to be able to grow from the experience. Really, I mean, scripture says that we comfort others with the same comfort we've received. That's the goal. If you have post-traumatic growth, you're going to be able to support others who have walked through who are walking through what you walked through.
Yeah.
And that's part of the growth process, actually, is to start interacting with others who are in need. But you can't comfort everyone else until you've experienced the comfort yourself.
Yeah. Are there other things that you would say if somebody has suffered a trauma and they're trying to heal and they've taken steps to get some counseling and some therapy and some treatments for that? What are some other things that they can do to perhaps increase the likelihood that they will grow through it and become stronger because of it?
Yeah, the book outlines several things that we can do, and it's really a process. And I guess some of the practical activities include journaling. I do a section on journaling in there, and journaling can go south real quick if we don't do it correctly. So I do lay out like a process for journaling so that you're not just always writing about the negative and spiraling down. There needs to be hope in your journaling. And so I give some very practical tips for how to do that. It's such a process. From the immediate aftermath of the trauma, you just need to make sure your basic needs are met, right? That you're eating, that you're sleeping, that you have those basic needs. And it's really all about you at first. I find it interesting. I've heard people say, they made that trauma all about them. Trauma is all about you when you're in the bullseye.
Yeah.
It is. And so when I think about the things that it takes to get to growth, if you picture a target, right? The person who's experienced the trauma is in the bullseye in that moment.
Okay.
The person, maybe their family members around them who were also traumatized, but it wasn't a trauma that happened to them.
Yeah.
They're in the next ring out.
Yeah.
Okay. And so on and so forth. And so in the immediate aftermath, the person in the bullseye can behave however they need to behave. They can complain, they can scream, they can shout, they can be angry, and everybody else needs to just respect that, right?
Okay.
The people in the next ring out, they too might need to do some screaming and shouting and fighting. They can only do that to people in the rings that are bigger than theirs. Never, ever do you vent in to somebody closer to the trauma. So that's kind of a visual. And so in the beginning, it's all about you. But as you process through recovery, you start to move to the outer rings and other people move into the center, right?
Yeah.
So as you work through your healing, you're going to be better able to comfort in to people who are in trauma.
Yeah.
And it's a process. And so in the book, I talk about, like I said, some very just practical things that you can do on your own. I talk about therapy and therapeutic approaches, but it's a long process. I've often heard people say, well, this happened to me, and so I'm going to write a book about it. Or I'm going to, I want everybody to hear my story. Your story's not complete until you've walked through the healing.
Yeah.
And when you look back, the story's going to make a whole lot more sense. So do the healing first.
Yeah.
And then work toward growth.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned, I'd never heard it referred to as like the bullseye, and the person that has been traumatized is the one at the center, and then the rings out. And you're not supposed to scream or vent to someone closer to the inside. So as a family member, if something happened to a member of my family and I'm angry, I need to vent outside of my family. not to the person that was traumatized, because that would be
Right.
damaging to them. And I hadn't heard it referred to that way, because it may not be intuitive to somebody. You're just all together and you may just kind of stir the pot. But I think that's very helpful to know that if we have a friend or a loved one or someone that we know that has gone through that we need to be aware of who and how we process it, and not with somebody that's closer to them,
Right.
because that could be harmful.
It is so easy to do.
Yeah.
I think I tell a story in the book about a woman who learned halfway through her pregnancy that the baby wouldn't survive outside of the womb. And another friend was pregnant. And that friend, of course, she's seeing this trauma and she's going, oh, could that happen to me? Right?
Yeah.
But what she did was she went to the person in the trauma and said, I'm so scared. What if this happens to me? Oh my gosh, I'm terrified. My anxiety. Okay, now they're making it about them.
Yeah.
And they're not in the bullseye. Does she have anxiety? Yes. And there are people she can talk to, but don't go to the person who's experiencing the trauma.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I'd never heard it put that way. So I think it's very helpful for anyone that knows someone or has a family member or something else going through that it's helpful. And as you mentioned, I am sure there is a lot of other helpful information. It's going to be a great book that is releasing very soon. And one of the questions that that I like to ask, or I believe you remember that I like to ask, unfortunately, because of the trauma that happened to you in the assault, your passion has been to help others to recover and to thrive in theirs. What would you say to encourage someone else to pursue whatever passion that God has placed in their heart?
Well, first of all, to know what to pursue is exactly that. Identify what passion God has put into your heart. And then the next step is heal.
Okay.
Heal from whatever that is. And then start to research. Because we have to have not only the passion, but we have to have some knowledge and some skill to do that. And in doing that, I think that's part of post-traumatic growth.
Very good. And if someone is interested in getting the book, connecting with you for many of the things that you do and you offer, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, the Trauma Tree is available now for pre-order anywhere you get books. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and such. The book is called The Trauma Tree, Going Beyond Survival, Growing Toward Wholeness. And you can find that anywhere books are sold. My website is lisasaruga.com. It's Saruga is Saruga.
Okay.
You can find me on Instagram at Lisa Saruga, on Facebook, Lisa Saruga Author.
And we will put those links in the show notes for people to get a hold of them. And Lisa, thank you. I know there's so much more we didn't get into, but I appreciate your bravery and your obedience. As always, I just think you're amazing. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me today on A Woman's Heart. I'm Lisa Granger. I hope you found my conversation with Lisa Saruga informative and helpful. Her website and link to the book, The Trauma Tree, will be in the show notes. If this touched you at all, would you please share the show with someone who could benefit? One of the reasons why I do this show and the people on it write or speak is to help others. You can find more shows on my website, lisagranger.com, or on all the major podcast platforms. Until next time, have a blessed day.